December 29, 2024, 8:59 a.m., a Boeing 737 approaches Muan International Airport in South Korea. Jeju Air Flight 7C2216, 179 people on board. Families returning from Christmas holidays, tourists from Bangkok, children, grandparents. Within 4 minutes, only 2 of those 179 will still be alive. Not the pilots, not a child. 2 flight attendants seated at the very back of the aircraft. Everything else, ash, twisted metal, and bodies that will have to be identified by DNA. What happened in those 4 minutes? The official story? A bird strike. But here's what you won't hear on the news. The aircraft touched down on its belly and slid almost a mile down the runway. Fully intact. Crew conscious. They almost made it. Almost. Because at the end of the runway they hit a wall. A 4-meter concrete wall. Reinforced steel. And by every international aviation standard, it should not have been there. Today we take apart this crash piece by piece. The engines, the birds, the decisions in the cockpit, the silence in the cabin, and then the thing that actually killed these people, a bureaucratic decision made 7 years before, signed by a man most Koreans have never heard of. Who built that wall? Who signed off on it? And why, within weeks of this crash, 7 other Korean airports began tearing their own walls down? This is Black Box. We break the silence. Before we start, one thing I want you to hold on to. Every number I give you comes from the KAIB preliminary report of January 2025 or the final report of February 2026. Where I cite Korean reporting, it comes from Sisain magazine's investigation published in May of 2025, confirmed by internal documents from Korea Airports Corporation. I am not speculating. The story is bad enough without it. Let's begin. Boeing 737-800, registration HL8088, 15 years old. For a commercial airliner, that's not old, that's middle age. Many of the 737s flying today are older. The Boeing 737 Next Generation, which includes the 737-800, is one of the most produced aircraft in history. Over 7,000 units built. Thousands still in active service. This particular airframe had logged over 60,000 flight hours, maintained on schedule by Jeju Air. The carrier itself, South Korea's largest low-cost operator, founded in 2005. Clean safety record prior to this incident. No fatalities in its operating history. The aircraft's last major inspection, an A-check, was performed 6 weeks before the crash. Hydraulic systems tested, engine cowlings inspected, landing gear cycled, emergency systems verified, everything logged, everything signed off. The crew. Captain, 45 years old, 6,500 hours on type. A former Korean Air Force pilot who transitioned to commercial aviation in 2015, rated on the 737 since 2017. First officer, 39, 3,000 hours. Also Korean Air Force background. 4 cabin crew, all Korean nationals, all with over 3 years of service. Professional, experienced, nothing on their records that raises a flag. The route, Bangkok to Muan, 5.5 hours overnight. Unremarkable. Thai resorts are a popular winter destination for Koreans, and Flight 7C2216 was full. 175 passengers. Plus 4 cabin crew, plus the 2 pilots. 181 people total, though the official reports cite passenger and crew totals separately. Departure from Suvarnabhumi Airport in Bangkok was on time, 12:08 a.m. local time. The flight climbed to a cruise altitude of 36,000 feet. No turbulence, no diversions, no chatter with air traffic control beyond standard position reports. They began their descent into Muan at 8:48 a.m. Korean time. Visibility, good. Wind, within limits, approximately 6 knots from the south-southwest. Temperature, -3 Celsius. Standard winter morning in South Jeolla Province. The crew requested runway 19. Muan's primary runway runs roughly north-south, with the approach from the north descending toward the 19 end. Tower cleared them at 8:52 a.m. And then something happened that occurs thousands of times a year in aviation, something that almost always ends without consequences. A bird strike. Here's a statistic most passengers don't know. In the United States alone, the FAA records roughly 16,000 bird strikes per year. Globally, the number is in the hundreds of thousands. Most are minor. Many aircraft don't even land to inspect. The damage is often superficial: a dent, a bloodstain, a slightly bent turbine blade. But every aviation investigator knows the two cases that change the conversation about birds and engines. The first, US Airways Flight 1549, January 2009. Captain Chesley Sullenberger. A flock of Canada geese struck both engines at 3,000 feet. Both lost thrust. Sully landed in the Hudson River. Everyone survived. Aviation legend. The second, Jeju Air 7C2216, December 2024. A flock of Baikal teal ducks struck both engines at approximately 1,000 feet. Both lost thrust. Everyone died except two. The difference between a miracle and a mass casualty was never the birds. It was the 4 minutes after. Let's talk about those 4 minutes. 8:57 a.m., 40 seconds. Altitude, 1,000 feet. Speed, 240 knots, which is roughly 276 miles per hour. The flock was estimated by radar playback at between 80 and 100 birds, mostly Baikal teals, a medium-sized duck that winters in Korean wetlands. The Muan area sits adjacent to a major bird sanctuary. This is known. Every pilot approaching Muan is briefed on bird activity. The ingestion was captured on the engine fan vibration sensors. Both engines, simultaneously, within 300 milliseconds of each other. The right engine, a CFM 56-7B turbofan, immediately began compressor stalls. This is the engine equivalent of choking. Airflow becomes erratic. Thrust drops. In under 2 seconds, the engine flamed out. Dead. The left engine fared slightly better, partial ingestion, thrust reduced to approximately 40% of takeoff power. Not enough to maintain level flight with landing gear and flaps extended, but not zero. In aviation, this is called a worst-case scenario. Losing thrust in one engine, every crew is trained for it, hundreds of hours of simulator time. Losing both is a training exercise nobody has real experience with. Dual bird strikes of this scale happen maybe once per decade across the entire global commercial fleet. The first officer gets out one word: Mayday. Then the training kicks in. The captain takes controls. The first officer works the emergency checklist. Air traffic control is notified. All of this in the span of 11 seconds. What follows comes from the flight data recorder. Reconstructed minute by minute. 8:58:03 seconds. The right engine flames out completely. The EGT, exhaust gas temperature, spikes to 1,400 Celsius, then drops to ambient. The engine is physically dead. 8:58:14 seconds. Crew requests immediate landing on the opposite end of the runway. In other words, runway 01, not 19. They need to get down fast. Turning back to the airport from a low altitude with one engine failing is the classic aviation emergency procedure. It's called a return to field. It requires roughly 90 seconds to set up. They have less than 2 minutes. 8:58:27 seconds. Left engine cascade failure begins. Compressor stalls, EGT rising. The one good engine is now dying. 8:58:34 seconds. Hydraulic pressure in the A system drops below operational minimum. This is critical. The Boeing 737-800 has two primary hydraulic systems, A and B, plus a standby. System A powers the primary flight controls, landing gear, thrust reversers, and brakes. System B powers rudder, flaps, and backup controls. Both systems depend on engine-driven pumps. Without engines, there's no pressure, and without pressure, landing gear will not extend automatically. Flaps will not extend. Brakes don't work. There is a backup. An electric motor-driven pump can pressurize System B in emergencies, and landing gear can be released through a manual gravity drop. The pilot pulls a handle in the cockpit floor, and the gear falls out under its own weight, locking into place. Both backups require time. The manual gear drop takes approximately 45 seconds from handle pull to lockdown indication. The crew didn't have 45 seconds. 8:59:01. The aircraft begins approach from the opposite direction. Runway 01. But too fast. Speed 350 km per hour or roughly 190 knots. Normal landing speed for a 737-800 with full flaps, 140, maybe 145 knots. They are 50 knots too fast, with no flaps to slow them down, no gear to create drag, and only partial thrust on the one engine that's still barely turning. 8:59:15. The crew attempts to extend the gear using the emergency system. Mechanical release, gravity, not enough time. 8:59:50. The Boeing touches down, on its belly, at 190 knots. Here's where it gets remarkable. An aircraft without landing gear is essentially a flying iron. Enormous mass scraping concrete, eating friction, generating sparks, smoke. A sound that residents 3 kilometers away would later describe as an explosion in the sky. But the aircraft held together. More than that, it stayed controllable. The pilots kept it aligned with the centerline. The wings didn't drag. The tail didn't separate. The crew were, in the words of one retired 737 captain I spoke with, doing everything exactly right. Everything. 1,000 meters down the runway, 1,200, 1,400, speed dropping, 120 knots, 180. On airport security footage, you can see it. The aircraft is slowing. Visibly. At the moment it passes the 1,800-meter mark, it's moving at approximately 90 kilometers per hour. Easily survivable speed. Easily stoppable, given enough runway. But there wasn't enough runway. Runway 19 at Muan is 2,800 meters long. The Boeing used every bit of it. And then it overran. At approximately 80 knots, that's 90 miles per hour, it left paved ground and hit what was waiting at the end. Let me describe exactly what the crew saw in their final seconds, because this matters. This is where the investigation lives. Beyond the end of runway 19 at Muan stands an earthen berm, a dirt mound, topped by a reinforced concrete structure 4 meters tall, steel rebar anchored 2 meters into the ground. The entire assembly is approximately 15 meters wide. On that berm sits an ILS localizer, instrument landing system equipment that helps aircraft line up with the runway in bad visibility. It's a necessary component of any modern airport with instrument approach capability. Here's the rule. Under the International Civil Aviation Organization Standard, ICAO Annex 14, Volume 1, Chapter 3, any obstacle in the runway and safety area must be frangible, meaning it must break apart on impact. Easily, it must not cause catastrophic damage to an aircraft that overruns the runway. This rule was not invented recently. It has existed in various forms since the 1960s. The concept of frangibility is one of the most established principles in aviation safety. Countless runway overruns around the world have been survivable specifically because the obstacles at the end gave way. In 2010 at San Francisco, Asiana Flight 214 undershot the runway, struck a seawall, and still 69% of passengers survived, in part because the seawall was lower and softer than a reinforced concrete berm. In 2015 at LaGuardia, Delta Flight 1086 slid off a runway through a frangible blast fence and stopped in the snow. No fatalities. The blast fence did exactly what it was designed to do: collapse on impact. In 2019 at Kazakhstan, Beck Air Flight 2100 clipped a concrete wall on takeoff. 12 died. The wall was found to be non-compliant with ICAO standards. It was demolished within 6 months of the crash. The pattern is consistent. When airports follow ICAO frangibility rules, people live. When they don't, people die. The Muan installation was not frangible. It was a monolithic concrete and earth construction, engineered to withstand earthquakes and typhoons. When Jeju Air 7C-2216 struck that wall at 90 miles per hour, the fuselage collapsed like a crushed can. Fuel tanks ruptured. There was a fireball. 177 people died instantly. 2 more died in the hospital that same day. Only 2 survived. Flight attendants at the rear of the aircraft. The tail section tore off at impact and landed 50 meters clear of the main fire. One of those flight attendants, a 25-year-old woman, was later interviewed by Korean state broadcaster KBS. She said she remembers the sound of impact. She remembers the tail spinning. She remembers opening her eyes in a field, upside down, with seatbelt straps holding her to a chair that was no longer attached to anything. She does not remember getting out. The other survivor, a 31-year-old senior flight attendant, suffered third-degree burns on 30% of her body. She is still undergoing reconstructive surgery. They are the only two people alive who heard what happened in that cabin in the final seconds. Neither of them has publicly shared what they heard. This is what investigators from ICAO and the American NTSB, both invited by Korean authorities, wrote in the joint preliminary report issued January 2025. Quote from the KAIB final report, February 2026. Absent the structure at the end of runway 19, the aircraft would have continued sliding onto soft terrain and decelerated within approximately 100 meters. Estimated probability of passenger fatality in such a scenario, below 5%. Below 5%. Instead of 100. That wall killed 177 people. Now let's talk about where that wall came from. Muan Airport opened in November 2007. Local officials in South Jeolla province had lobbied for over a decade to get federal funding for a regional airport. The justification was economic development. Muan is in a relatively rural part of southwest Korea, far from Seoul, and local leaders wanted tourism and business. It never worked out. Passenger traffic was minimal. For years, Muan handled fewer than 100,000 passengers annually, an insignificant number by Korean standards. Gimpo Airport in Seoul, for comparison, handles 25 million. Jeju handles 30 million. Muan was a political project that never delivered its promise, but they did get their infrastructure budget, and they built to specification. At first, the original design, filed with Korean aviation authorities in 2005 before construction began, reviewed by ICAO consultants, approved by Korea Airports Corporation, the state-owned entity that operates Muan, and 14 other airports nationwide. The original ILS localizer at the approach end of runway 19 was specified as a standard frangible installation. Aluminum mast, 3 meters tall, quick-release mounting. In the event of a runway overrun, the mast would shear off and cause minimal damage. Standard, boring, safe. Then in 2017, something changed. In May of 2025, journalists from the Korean investigative outlet Sisain obtained the revised construction documents through a Freedom of Information request. They found a memo dated March 15, 2017, titled, in translation, Runway 19 ILS Localizer Installation Reinforcement. The memo authorized a replacement. The frangible aluminum mast was to be removed. In its place, a concrete and earth berm 4 meters tall, reinforced with steel rebar, anchored into the ground. Stated reason? To improve equipment resistance to extreme weather conditions, in other words, typhoons. The revision was signed by a director at Korea Airports Corporation. His name has not been released publicly, though it appears in unredacted versions of the memo that have leaked. Approved by a contractor from Hyundai Engineering, Hyundai's civil engineering division, which has built airport infrastructure across Asia for decades. Here's the problem. The international standard for frangibility in the runway end safety area supersedes local considerations. You cannot just revise it with a domestic memo. To legally change the frangibility status of an ILS installation, the revision must go through the Korean Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport, and from there it must be formally notified to ICAO through Korea's designated aviation authority. This process on average takes 4 to 6 months. It requires engineering analysis, risk assessment, and sign-off from multiple stakeholders. The Muan revision had none of that. KAIB states this directly in the final report. Such a design change should have gone through the Ministry of Transport. And through ICAO. It did neither. In plain language, somebody in 2017 checked a box and forgot. That box killed 177 people. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn. After the crash, predictable things started happening. The kind of things bureaucracies always do. Responsibility blurred. Version 1. It was the pilot's fault. A handful of Korean commentators, mostly conservative, argued that the belly landing was the crew's choice, not a necessity. That they had other options. Divert to Jeju. Attempt a ditching in the Yellow Sea. Fly until fuel exhaustion. Anything but land on runway 19. These commentators ignored one fact. The crew had 90 seconds from the moment both engines failed to the moment they touched down. 90 seconds. Any of those alternate scenarios, Jeju, ditching, fuel exhaustion, would have required at least 3 to 4 minutes of controlled flight. They did not have 3 to 4 minutes. They had 90 seconds. Version 2. It was Boeing. The landing gear should have extended automatically, even with hydraulic failure. Boeing responded, politely, firmly, and publicly, no, it should not have. That behavior is explicitly documented in the 737 operating manual. Emergency gear extension requires pilot action. The manual release is designed that way specifically to prevent unintended deployment in flight. Boeing's response included a technical review of the flight data recorder, which confirmed that all aircraft systems had performed as designed. The aircraft did not fail the crew. The crew did not fail the aircraft. Within the physics of the situation, this was an unsurvivable crash regardless of airframe. Version 3. It was the birds. This is the version that satisfies everyone. Because birds are nature, nobody's accountable. Korean state broadcaster KBS ran a special documentary in April 2025 titled, in translation, The Birds of Muan. It framed the crash as a tragic accident caused by bird migration patterns. It barely mentioned the berm. It did not mention the 2017 memo at all. This documentary was quietly pulled from the KBS archive in October 2025, after the Sisain investigation went public. But to the credit of Korean investigators, KAIB's final report, released February 1st, 2026, named the primary cause directly. Not birds, not pilots, not Boeing, infrastructure. Specifically, the non-compliant ILS localizer structure at the end of runway 19 at Muan International. Following that report, South Korea conducted a review of every regional airport. They found 6 additional installations with potentially dangerous configurations. All 6 are being modified right now to ICAO standard. The modifications are expected to be complete by the end of 2027. But here's what they're saying very quietly. In May 2026, 32 countries filed a petition with ICAO requesting a global audit of similar violations. Who initiated it? Japan. The same Japanese aviation authority that has been watching Korean compliance very carefully after a series of earlier incidents. The preliminary audit found 72 airports worldwide with comparable structures. 72. Let me give you some examples, because this is where it stops being a Korean story and becomes a global one. In Nepal, Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, not the famous Lukla but the capital, has a concrete boundary wall approximately 150 meters past the end of runway 02. ICAO audit flagged it as non-compliant in 2023. Nepal has not yet modified it. In Brazil, Congonhas Airport in Sao Paulo, the airport where TAM Flight 3054 overshot a runway and killed 199 people in 2007, still has concrete obstacles within the runway end safety area. Brazilian authorities claim they are studying compliance options. In the Philippines, Calabo International Airport, a major hub for tourist traffic to Boracay, has a reinforced concrete fence at the end of runway 06. ICAO audit flagged it in 2024. Status under review. 72 airports, 72 walls. Somewhere, right now, pilots are landing in front of every one of them, which means right now, today, there are thousands of flights approaching runways with a concrete wall at the end. Just like Muan. Somebody, somewhere decided to save money, or simplify the build, or reinforce something against a storm, or they just did it the same way they'd always done it, without looking up the current standards. And if a crew ever misses the runway by half a kilometer, those passengers become a statistic. Let's talk about something the Korean press has been quietly avoiding. In March 2025, 3 senior officials at Korea Airports Corporation resigned. The resignations were quiet. Press releases cited personal reasons. No connection to the Jeju Air investigation was officially made, but all 3 had been in their positions since before 2017. All 3 had signature authority on infrastructure modifications, and all 3 left Korea within 6 weeks of their resignations. The location they relocated to is not a matter of public record. Korean media have not pursued this angle aggressively. I bring it up because investigative journalists in Sisain have mentioned it in passing, but no outlet has done a deep follow-up. You may draw your own conclusions about why. Meanwhile, the families of the 177 victims have filed a class action suit against Korea Airports Corporation, the Korean Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport, and Hyundai Engineering. The case is scheduled to begin pre-trial hearings in Seoul Central District Court in September 2026. The lead attorney for the families is a man named Park Jun-seok, a former prosecutor who left government service specifically to handle this case. He has been granted access to documents that have not yet been released publicly. In a press conference in January 2026, he stated, quote, "Everything you will hear in court has been buried by people who signed documents they should not have signed. The truth will not stay buried." We'll see. Let's go back to 8:59 a.m., December 29th, 2024. The pilots did everything right. The crew were professionals. The aircraft was airworthy. The system worked. They got unlucky with the birds. That's true. But they compensated with skill. They landed a dead stick Boeing on its belly. They kept it on the runway. They almost stopped it. Almost. They weren't betrayed by Boeing. Not by the engines, not by the procedures. They were betrayed by a document signed by a bureaucrat in 2017, so that an ILS antenna could better resist wind. 177 people burned alive in under 5 seconds. 2 flight attendants in the tail heard them. Those attendants survived. They live with that every day. Here's the question I want you sitting with. Next time you board a flight to somewhere warm, can you look out at the end of that runway and tell me there is no wall? The answer is no, you can't, because that information is not public. Only the people who designed it know. Aviation safety is often described as a chain of small decisions. Each one seems minor in isolation. Add them up, and they define whether you live or die. For 177 people on Jeju Air 7C2216, the chain included a Pacific duck migration, 2 stalled engines, 90 seconds of cockpit decisions, and a concrete wall built 8 years before they were born. They did nothing wrong. They bought tickets. They kissed their children goodbye. They boarded a routine flight home. The system failed them. Before we close, let me give you a few more pieces of this puzzle that didn't make it into the mainstream coverage. The 2 surviving flight attendants. The 25-year-old woman, her name has not been released to the public, but Korean tabloids identified her as a recent hire, only 11 months into her aviation career. She had trained on tail seat safety protocols. One specific procedure, bracing against the bulkhead, gripping the rear galley handrails, head tucked, almost certainly saved her life. When the tail separated, her body position inside the rotating structure kept her spinal column intact. She walked away with a concussion and a fractured wrist. She has not returned to flight duties. The 31-year-old senior flight attendant, a 12-year Jeju Air veteran. She was the purser on the flight. Her injuries were significantly worse, and she has undergone 7 surgeries so far. Korean medical sources indicate her recovery timeline extends into 2027. She has, through her family, declined all interview requests. Neither has testified publicly. Both have been interviewed by KAIB investigators. Their testimony is sealed until the completion of civil proceedings. Next, a detail about Hyundai Engineering that matters. This is not the first time Hyundai Engineering has been connected to aviation infrastructure controversy. In 2015, a runway surface installation at Incheon International Airport Korea's primary international hub, was found to have improper drainage specifications, leading to ponding during heavy rain. The installation was redone at a cost of roughly $47 million. Hyundai Engineering absorbed most of the cost without admitting fault. In 2018, an airport apron expansion at Jeju Airport was delivered 6 months late, with surface irregularities that required resurfacing. Again, Hyundai Engineering covered the cost. These incidents did not result in fatalities, but they establish a pattern. A pattern of infrastructure delivered below specification, with quiet cost absorption used to paper over compliance issues. When the Muan ILS modification was signed in 2017, it fit that pattern. Until this time, there were no casualties to make it matter. Now there are 177. Another detail. The KAIB final report of February 2026 contains a technical annex that most reporters have not read. In that annex, investigators documented something called known non-compliance inheritance. That's bureaucratic language for this problem existed, authorities knew about it, and they kept flying over it anyway. Internal Korea Airports Corporation documents cited in the annex show that at least 2 internal safety reviews between 2020 and 2023 raised concerns about the Muan ILS configuration. Both reviews were closed without action. Both were classified as infrastructure upgrade deferred pending budget allocation. In plain language, we know, but we can't afford to fix it, so we're crossing our fingers. They crossed their fingers for 7 years. On December 29th, the fingers failed. Let me also mention, because we should, the bird sanctuary adjacent to Muan Airport. It's called the Muan Wetland Reserve. It is home to approximately 12,000 migratory birds during peak season, which in Korea runs from November through February, including the Baikal teal ducks that killed Jeju Air 7C2-216. The sanctuary was established in 1996. The airport was built in 2007. In order, aviation planners worldwide understand that putting a commercial airport within 3 kilometers of a major bird sanctuary is, at best, problematic. At worst, it is a pending disaster. Bird strikes in Korea specifically are documented at 3 to 4 times the global rate, largely because of this kind of geographic mismatch. The recommendations for mitigation exist. Radar-based bird detection systems, grass management to discourage nesting, acoustic deterrence, trained falcon programs. Muan has one of the least developed bird management programs of any major Korean airport. This does not excuse the wall. The wall is what killed these people. But the bird strike that started the chain was, statistically, not a question of if, but when. Let's return to 8:59 a.m. December 29th, 2024. The pilots did everything right. The crew were professionals. The aircraft was airworthy. The system worked. They got unlucky with the birds. That's true. But they compensated with skill. They landed a dead-stick Boeing on its belly. They kept it on the runway. They almost stopped it. Almost. They weren't betrayed by Boeing, not by the engines, not by the procedures. They were betrayed by a document signed by a bureaucrat in 2017, so that an ILS antenna could better resist wind. 177 people burned alive in under 5 seconds. 2 flight attendants in the tail heard them. Those attendants survived. They live with that every day. Here's the question I want you sitting with. Next time you board a flight to somewhere warm, can you look out at the end of that runway and tell me there is no wall? The answer is no, you can't. Because that information is not public. Only the people who designed it know. Aviation safety is often described as a chain of small decisions. Each one seems minor in isolation. Add them up, and they define whether you live or die. For 177 people on Jeju Air 7C2216, the chain included a Pacific duck migration, 2 stalled engines, 90 seconds of cockpit decisions, and a concrete wall built 8 years before they were born. They did nothing wrong. They bought tickets. They kissed their children goodbye. They boarded a routine flight home. The system failed them. If you want us to keep digging, subscribe. We have more.